What is good, Tesla family? It's Ray J back with another video. And in this one, I want to break down what's happening with Tesla, SPY, Nvda, the QQQ, and a couple of other tickers. I'm going to break down what's happening with the economic calendar moving forward, what's going on with other factors involving the markets, what you should be watching for as time progresses. But before I break the devil's information, before I get into any more details about Tesla and the markets, let me just mention a couple of things. I am firstly not a financial planner, so take nothing I say as financial advice. And also, if you guys can, please check out the Moo link, which is down below and in the description. If you sign up for Moon deposit $100, you are guaranteed 7 free stocks, and the offer ends very soon in just about 5 days from now. Anyways, when it comes to Tesla, we saw a very, very interesting move today. We got a very, very nice pump on Tesla, SPY, and the QQQ in the morning, as we saw Nvidia breaking all-time highs and sustaining its levels very, very well. However, the market really failed to hold those levels, and we saw a very, very big rejection that happened intraday. And this is just the big guys moving liquidity around based off different factors. This doesn't necessarily mean that everything was just solely driven by, I would say, like pieces of news and everything like that. And I would say that it's very important to pay attention to price action, especially as we progress from here. So for Tesla, in my morning video, I told you all that Tesla would likely test 182. If we held above this, Tesla could push hard to fill this gap. If we failed to hold 182, expect some downside all the way down towards at least 175. Our next level below that would have been 173. That's what ended up happening to Tesla. We failed to hold 182, so the bearish possibility played out. For SPY, I told you all that SPY would likely hit 534, and if we held above that, we'd likely see a continuation higher. If we failed to hold that, I said to watch 532. If we lost that, we'd be looking for a dip back down, and that's exactly what happened as well. And the dip continued. It even went lower than what I was expecting, but it still continued to fall, and that's a-okay because we're approaching a very, very important level. QQQ, same thing. I told everyone to watch this support all the way over here around this 460 area. Losing that would open the doors for a bigger drop to at least 457. And if we lost that, I'd be looking for moves all the way down here. And that's what also played out. So we did actually provide warnings for the markets about this as we approach these levels in the morning. So now the question is, what's going to happen moving forward? What do I think is going to happen for Friday? And that's why I want to first talk about some data, break down some news and such first before I break down these charts, because you need to know some very important things. Tomorrow is going to be Friday, May 24th, 2024 at 9:35 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So before or very, very close to the time the market opens, we have Waller from the Fed giving a speech. And then at 10 o'clock a.m., so that's 30 minutes after market open, we have the Michigan Consumer Sentiments data, the 5-year inflationary expectations, and some data like this. Now, one thing worth noting is that today, when the PMI data came out, right, this data wasn't that bad. It was actually so-so overall. And despite that, the market tanked. And my point in saying this is because the data is just used oftentimes as an excuse, as noise that is used as a reason for these market makers and institutions to move liquidity around. That's why sometimes when CPI is decent, the market pumps. Sometimes when CPI is decent, the market dumps. It's all over the place. And they just use this data as an excuse. So with me saying that, I just want to make it very clear that tomorrow at 10 a.m., watch this data very carefully when we get this release, and we'll see what the reaction is. Expect some high volatility at 10 a.m. and be prepared for what's about to come. So we're going to be looking for a lot of price action during the first 30 minutes tomorrow. I think that there's going to be a high volatility, and I'll break down more details about that in just a few minutes. For tomorrow for SPY, we have a very, very interesting put to call ratio, a 1.76 puts to call ratio. The majority positions are puts expiring for just SPY, and we have a 527 max pain. So could we see a little bit more downside on SPY than a bounce back up to max pain? It's always a possibility. I'll talk more about that very soon. And then we also have a very interesting looking fear and greed index. This is currently quite neutral, a little bit closer to greed. It's kind of shifting, but could shift a bit more, and we'll see if that continues. Market momentum is currently greedy. We'll see if this shifts as well. It's kind of shifting downwards, becoming a little bit more fearful. We'll see how that develops. And then the puts and call option positioning is currently greedy, as we're starting to see a little shift, though. We're starting to see some calls being closed, more put buying, and we're starting to see a lot more shorts piling in. So will the shorts end up continuing to drag the market lower? Or will something else shift? And also, the VIX, although it's pushing hard, hasn't officially broken the 50 daily moving average. So there's no confirmation for the VIX just yet. So we have to be more patient. For earnings that just came out, as a reminder, Nvidia did very well, breaking all-time highs thanks to them beating on EPS and revenue, good guidance, the stock split, the potential buyback, and lots of very, very good news and growth in their net income and such. That's why Nvidia did very, very well, and it's continuing to hold near all-time highs, whereas the market pushed initially, but it wasn't able to sustain the levels it was at. For more earnings, we just had TD Bank, then Ross announced their earnings. Just real quick for Ross, they ended up beating on EPS with $1.46. They beat on revenue with $4.86 billion. And we actually saw them announce some good guidance for the second quarter with a 5% increase in their overall sales, with a nice improvement in the EPS. But their fiscal 2025 EPS is a little bit short of what analysts want. Very, very close, but just a little bit short. It's not really enough to cause the share price to drop because instead the share price is up because the overall data kind of trumps that. So that's good for Ross. Anyways, enough about Ross and others. Let's focus on Tesla. What's going on with this before I break down the share price? So, as a reminder, when it comes to the way Tesla is moving, there's been a lot of talk about Elon Musk. I made a video about all these headlines coming out about him. I think it's very important to pay attention. Musk says that he favors no tariffs on Chinese EVs, and he believes that it's going to be a disruptive catalyst for the overall economy. That's kind of like the way that he saw it. Now, is he right or wrong? That's up to you to decide, but I just want to share his view. And moving forward, there's also some news coming out that Tesla has dropped a delivery goal of 20 million vehicles a year from the latest reports. Now, the thing is, it's not necessarily that they're saying it's not going to happen. It's more like they just left out this goal when it comes to making estimations for 2030. So I can't really comment too much on whether or not this is true. I can't say that, yes, Tesla's saying they're not going to do it, they're not going to reach it. They didn't actually confirm that, they just didn't mention it. Now, Tesla is kind of prioritizing the robotaxi. I do agree with that, and also AI, but we'll see what happens with the deliveries projections. Another thing worth noting is that I'm not solely focused on 2030 because we have so many other bullish catalysts as we approach that time frame, from the robotaxi to FSD to sales, and the list goes on, from Tesla Energy and such. So I want to make it very clear that that's a very, very far projection that's many years ahead of us. And we're just going to focus on what happens on a quarterly basis, maybe even 1 year out, and just take it one step at a time. So do I hope Tesla reaches this goal? Of course I do. But the thing is, I'm not going to make too many comments about this because we have to get confirmation from Tesla. I'm not going to assume that they're just giving up on this, right? You can't make that assumption just yet. So we'll see what Tesla confirms later on. Volume is currently at 72 million. That's currently a little bit below average. So we didn't really fall on super high volume. Short volume is still going up as more sellers are stepping in and more shorts. We still have overweight ratings from different analysts. The price price ratio is kind of flat right now, not really doing anything too crazy. And we have a tendency of seeing more volatility on Fridays. We actually are green about 49% of the time. Look for more green during the first 30 minutes, more volatility then. So at 10 a.m., noon, and then 2 p.m. are some of the most volatile hours for Tesla historically. And then once again, despite the fact that May is not looking that great for Tesla, we did get a little push in May before getting a little rejection. June is historically a much stronger month, so we'll see if that ends up playing out. But with that being said, guys, now I'm just going to focus more on the charts and talk about what I think is going to play out for Tesla and the others. So for Tesla, let's talk about something very simple. If you look at Tesla, Tesla is kind of sitting on a trampoline. And what I mean by that is around this 172 to 173 area, we have a trampoline here. Tesla bounced here, came back down, came a little bit lower, got a big bounce from that, came down lower, bounced off that, and we're coming back down. So we have a nice support over here around this 172 to 173 area, despite the fact that the daily time frame is looking a little bit weaker, at least on the chart. And a lot of the news was kind of negative for today, lots of negative sentiment. So I do believe that there's a risk that Tesla could dip a little bit more, but we'll have to see how it ends up holding at 172. I personally think that SPY is going to dip a little bit more, so will the QQQ, but we could bounce if we hold critical supports, and I'll talk about those in just a minute. For Tesla, it looks to me like it might dip a little bit more. We have this gap over here. We could be testing the 172 or so, but we will see if we get a bounce or not off that level. So what I think is going to happen is this. First thing, let's talk about some levels, and I'll talk about what I think will happen. We have resistance currently at this 175 area, then 176.5. We have support currently at 173.25 and then 172. This entire zone is where we like to bounce like a trampoline. If we lose 172, I think Tesla could come all the way down to fill this gap at 168. So I'll be watching that. In simple terms, if we lose 172 and fail to hold it for a couple of hours, yes, Tesla is going to dip down to 168 most likely. If we break past 175 and then 176.5, we could be looking for a pushback up towards at least 178. What do I think is going to happen? I think tomorrow Tesla might pop a little bit and eventually start dipping back down to this 172 zone. And we're going to have a very, very big test right here. If the buyers are ready to defend Tesla, depending on the news, Tesla could bounce off 172 and make our way back up towards 175, just kind of shuffle up here. If we lose 172, we're going to be dipping down to 168 and then get the bounce. So look for a pop and drop down to this 172 zone. See if we bounce off that. If not, we're going to sink a little bit more to 168 and then get the bounce. All right. So either we bounce off 172 or we dip a little bit more, and then we bounce, or we end up dipping all the way down to about 168 and then get the bounce. So watch and see. Do we bounce off 172 or 168? It depends on which level ends up holding, which one breaks. But I do see a little bit more downside coming for Tesla before he attempts to bounce. That is the most likely possibility, in my personal opinion. How about for SPY? I have a very similar analysis of SPY. So SPY had a big drop today, and I think that the daily time frame is going to be pivotal for how I analyze this. Because on the daily time frame, we have a very bearish looking bar and a very, very big drop, and we have a big gap to fill. I wouldn't say it's that big, but it's like decent sized, all the way down to 523. So I think we're going to fill this gap very, very soon. I think we're going to fill that gap, and then we might try to bounce off here because historically, 523 to 522 is very close to the previous all-time high, and that is where we could see this thing attempt to bounce. So it's very close to this area right here. I think what's going to happen is this tomorrow, and let me actually break down the levels first before I talk about that. So SPY has resistance at 526.64. If we break that, look for 528 and then 529.5. We have support at 525. If we lose that, look for the gap fill all the way down to the 523s and then 522.6. If we lose that, look for a dip all the way down to 520, then lower levels. But here's my analysis, okay? We're going to ignore these levels for a second. I think what's going to happen is SPY is going to rebound a bit in the morning, maybe hit 527 or so, then starts selling all the way down to fill this gap towards 523.25. I think that's going to happen, and then we're going to be watching this 523 area. If we hold it very nice, this 522 to 523 area, look for a bounce all the way back up to 527 for a nice close, and then SPY can start a rebound. If we lose 522 to 523, there's going to be a bigger dip all the way down to 520 or lower. All right. So once again, just like Tesla, a little pop and drop is likely going to come, a gap fill most likely, and then see if SPY gets a bounce off 522 to 523 or not. That's going to be key for the way we end up moving, in my personal opinion. So a little pop and drop, and then we'll see if we get a bounce. It all depends on how we end up holding at 522 to 523, but I think we're going to likely fill that gap. For the QQQ, before I start talking about Nvidia and the others, just like SPY, I think something similar is going to happen. A little pop to about 450, 455 or so, maybe a little bit lower than that. Then a drop all the way down to about 450 is likely going to come. And then if we lose 450, we'll be looking at 446. It's going to likely bounce to one of those levels, in my personal opinion. I think the 4 hour is going to be vital for the way we look at this. So hold on, looking at the 4 hour, I just wanted to call out that the 450 area is going to be very close to where our 50 EMA is tomorrow. So I think the QQQ is going to pop a bit, maybe retest the 454.8 area around that zone, then start dipping down to about 450. If we don't bounce there, then it's going to be 446. At one of those levels, we should bounce. So watch and see. Do we drop to 450 and bounce, or do we drop to 446 and bounce? It's got to be one of those two. There's that big gap to fill at 446, so I do find that to be probable, but I do see a little bit of a dip coming before we try to get that bounce. There's a big gap here, so it might try to fill this gap first. We'll see if it ends up dropping that low or not, but I think that that's what's going to most likely happen. For Nvidia, the 4 hour is looking pretty good in my opinion. We might retest 1029 where our 0.236 retracement happens to be. If we lose that, we could be dipping closer to 1000 before we try to get a bounce. But I see a little drop coming. I do find that to be very, very probable in my opinion. So watch for that very, very carefully. For Apple also on the 4 hour is looking kind of weak. When we look at, let me just double check this, the daily time frame, Apple has these gaps to fill down here. So I think that we could actually dip a little bit more. We look kind of weak on the daily. So we're going to be looking for a pop into the 187 area, then dip all the way down towards these gap fills down here close to 185. And then I think we could bounce off one of those levels. So I think a little pop and drop is coming. I think we're going to be pushing all the way down to 185. Then we'll see if we get a bounce or not. And that's going to be key for the way we end up moving. But I anticipate a little bit more downside as a strong possibility. We'll see how things go from there. So look for a pop and drop on Apple and a move all the way down to fill our gap below, and we'll see what happens moving forward. Now, for Bitcoin's in a very, very important place right now. We've been dropping very, very hard, and I think that there is a risk of more downside. I'm going to pull up the 4 hour time frame on Bitcoin just to show you guys this. I think that Bitcoin is going to rebound a little bit tomorrow morning, hit the 68,000 area, then dip a little bit lower. And we might actually retest 66,000, if not 65,000, which is where our 200 EMA happens to be. And we're going to be looking for a bounce after that at one of those levels. Look for a rebound, a drop, and then we'll see how low we go before we get another bounce. That's the most likely possibility. All right, guys, so that is it for the main five that I typically go over. Now I'm just going to go through a speed run and talk about the rest of the tickers just to get this out of the way as fast as I possibly can. So let's talk about NEO. NEO got a very, very big drop today because of the fact that we had some negative news involving European tariffs. Look for a rebound to about $5, and I think it has this big gap to fill around 4.19. It might slowly just downtrend towards there as you approach June. But in June, we have deliveries and earnings, so it could bounce in June, but until then, it might actually downtrend. Palantir looks a little bit more bearish to me. I think that there's a very good chance it might actually retest. It's holding support right here. If we lose the support, I'm going to be looking for a move into the lower 20s before we try to get a bounce. But I think it's going to bounce in. Look for a little bit more downside for 20.5 to 20 before it tries to bounce. For super micro, I see more downside. The 4 hours looking kind of weak. We have a nice looking double top leg structure, and you guys can see right here we got a big rejection on the chart. So I wouldn't be surprised if we actually test around 860. The 860s then reject and start dipping down towards 826 and eventually 800. I think this range is going to be tested. So a pop and a drop all the way down here before we try to bounce again. We'll be watching for that on Super Micro. For Rivian has a head and shoulders like structure. If we lose support at 10, we're going to be looking for a dip all the way down towards 9.5. And if we end up breaking past 10.24, we'll see what happens. But I think that there's a chance it might dip a little bit more and before we try to get a bounce. I do see a risk with that as we're just barely holding 10. I have a bearish looking structure right now. For SoFi has a symmetrical structure, might retest just under 7 before it tries to continue to fall down here towards 6.68, then try to bounce after that. So I'll be watching for that. With IWM Russell 2000, we're going to be looking for 202. If we lose that, we're going to be looking for a dip all the way down towards, well, it depends if we hold 202. So it might kind of pop and then drop to 202. If we lose 202, look for 200 to this support zone. Basically, I have marks down here where the 2 white lines are. It's going to likely test previous resistance, becoming support. So either we hit 202, then we bounce, or if we lose that, we might come down to 200 and then get a bounce. But that's what I'm seeing for the IWM Russell 2000. For AMD, we're looking a little bit more bearish. I think that because we lost the support here, the next support's down here around 156. So watch 160. If we lose that, look for 156 and a bounce, or we could try to bounce from here. I'm not really counting on it, so we'll give it some time. For ARM, we're actually holding it very well on ARM, but it depends on if you hold the 50 EMA. If we hold the 111.46, look for a rebound towards 116. If we lose that, we're going to be dipping lower, but I do favor it trying to hold up, at least for now. For Coinbase, we're not looking that great. We're kind of shuffling around our key Fibonacci retracement areas. So I wouldn't be surprised if tomorrow we actually dip down a little bit, retest these key EMAs, which are kind of acting as a magnet around this 218 area. I might go a little bit lower. It really depends if we could hold or not. So we could be retesting like 216, then try to rebound all the way back up towards these higher levels. So look for a little dip and a bounce, and we'll see how things go, at least moving forward. For Amazon's kind of dipping a little bit more. We have support currently at 180. We're going to likely test that. So I think we're going to either bounce off 180, but if we fail to bounce, we could go down to like 178 and then try to bounce. So it's got to be one of those two. We either bounce off 180 or 178. So watch for that. Same thing on Meta. Meta has a bearish looking head and shoulders like structure, so be a little bit careful with this. If we lose support right over here around 462, we're going to be dipping all the way down towards, I would say, at least the 450s. If we hold 462 and bounce, then we're going to be looking for a move back up to 468. So watch for a test of 462 tomorrow and see if we bounce or not. Let me double check this. For Microsoft, I think that we're kind of dipping right now. We might dip all the way down to about 424 to 425 before we try to bounce. So watch and see how that ends up developing. Might be a little bit more downside before it tries. So watch for that. For Google is likely going to test 174. Excuse me. If we lose that, we have this previous resistance becoming support at 173. One of those levels is probably going to bounce. So I think it might dip towards 173 and try to bounce. So watch for that. GameStop, unfortunately, is looking more bearish. We lost support at 20. I was hoping we would hold that, but we failed. So look for the gap fill at 17 before it tries to bounce. I think 16.6 to 17 is going to be tested and see if we get a bounce. For AMC, temporarily it's looking a little bit weak. Could be shuffling right here around 4.5, but I still think that later on within the next 2 months, we're going to get a nice push to the upside again, just like this move over here. Do I think it's going to be that crazy? Not as wild as this going up to like $11 or anything like that, but I do think that we could push quite a bit in the next 2 months because we're still forming an accumulation structure as of right now. DJT, I think we might be retesting the 200 EMA at 42 and then try to bounce. There's not much going on with the VIX. Is trying to push a little bit, but we haven't officially broken past these imbalances. We haven't broken past 14 yet, so give it some time. And we'll see if the VIX gets a rejection after pushing or not. But as of right now, it's still not giving us confirmation. The 10-year is pushing a bit because the Fed has been a little bit more hawkish yesterday. So we'll see what happens with that moving forward, if it continues to push or not, as we have a gap to fill. If it does push higher, that could be a little bit bearish for the market, so that could signal more downside. And the dollar might go a little higher to this imbalance around 105.2, but there's no confirmation yet for either direction, so give it some time. With that being said, guys, for the way the market's moving, there is a risk of more downside on Tesla. We're just barely holding this 172 to 173 area. We could dip a little bit more, but we'll have to see if we get a bounce or not and just see how things end up developing. With that being said, I want to be very, very blunt with everyone that Tesla's looking a little bit more bearish, and there is a risk of this dipping a bit more. So be very, very careful. We'll see if Tesla can try to hold 172 or not. Don't forget that Tesla's also heavily news dependent. It's very manipulated. So be prepared for anything when it comes to levels, but just know that there is a risk of it dipping a little bit more before we get some kind of bounce. Okay. So watch the support. Let's see if Tesla holds up or not. And we'll see if which level it starts bouncing off of. I do believe it's going to dip a bit more first. So just be patient and do what you have to do, guys. Anyways, thank you all for listening. I hope you guys have a great rest of the day. And we'll all be back tomorrow morning to talk about the pre-market. Thank you for listening, guys. Have a great end of your day. Have a great evening, and peace out.